Hello everyone, this is the first of a set of videos that are going to run us through the question of what do we do if our markets are not actually perfectly competitive. So we learned about the perfectly competitive model and we realized how many assumptions it had. Now here's the thing, if I had to figure out what is going on by allowing everything to change at once, then it's kind of hard to figure it out. So I'm going to do this step by step, item by item, change one thing, change another. And now in this final section, we're going to learn just a piece, a little piece of all that's going to happen when you go to your next set of classes in economics. Having learnt the perfectly competitive model, what happens if the Ketris is not paribus and the market is not perfect? And because there are so many assumptions in that model, there are lots and lots of classes that take you through different types of adjustments to the model, depending on what we focus on when we relax our assumptions. So at this end of our 10-week quarter, we're just going to focus on a few elements of market failure, as it's called, but we're going to think this through by starting with what do we mean by market failure? The words market failure, they kind of feel like, oh, the markets failed us. Normally the markets are fine. Every so often they fail us and misbehave. That's not what we mean by that word. By market failure, we only mean what if the assumptions about perfect, bestest markets don't hold. And of course, there are so many assumptions about how to be perfect and bestest that nobody is arguing that market failure is an exception to the rule. In fact, for many of us, market failure is routine. It's what happens in the real world all the time. So remember that positive normative distinction? We are now in that world of the positive, where we're asking, what if these assumptions do not describe the world as it exists? Of course, there are very many ways of handling this. You can have heterodox economists who begin with different assumptions than the perfect market and say something different about how market works. But since we are in the neoclassical world, we are going to start with that abstraction of the perfect market and ask ourselves, well, wait. What if reality does not match the ideal abstraction? Hold in your head that the ideal abstraction is a theoretical abstraction. It's not the same thing as ethical ideals. That's the normative. What should happen. So even with perfect markets, you can say, I don't think that should be our priority. Our priority should be equity or ecology or something else. But we're still in that world of positive economics. What does the world look like? And so when I talk about market failure right now, I'm mainly talking about a positive description of the ways in which the real world is not the same thing as the abstract model. So this is just about positive economics, and we are going to ask ourselves, inside that, what happens if I relax this assumption? What does the world look like in my model? What happens if I relax that assumption? What happens in my model? The usefulness of the model is that sometimes I can look at these relaxations and say, if that's what happens, if the real world doesn't look like that, is there a way I can do policy to bring us closer to the ideal? And remember, the ideal is still got its limitations because it prioritizes efficiency. It doesn't really look at sustainability, blah, blah, blah. But we can use this way of operating to address those questions too. If, for example, you take class on ecological economics, where we ask ourselves about what happens. Given that we have a limited time, we obviously cannot cover every type of market failure. What I mean by market failure is every way in which real-world situations do not look like my model. So we are going to look at just a few of them. We're going to start with relaxing the assumption of perfect competition, where you have perfectly competitive firms who are all small and compete with each other and nobody controls the market. So I'm going to start by relaxing some of the assumptions about monopoly, and we're going to use that for me at the very end of this section to talk about other places and ways in which we don't have perfectly competitive markets. Monopoly is one. Oligopoly is another. Monopsony is another, and so on. So there are very many ways in which either on the supply side from firms, monopoly, oligopoly, where you only have one purchaser, that's monopoly, or you have a very small group that control the market as a cartel, such as OPEC, that's oligopoly. Or sometimes monopsony. For example, one of the debates in my own city of Seattle is the power that Amazon has, not just as a monopoly, but as a monopsony. So a monopsony is when you have control on the purchasing side of the market, not just the selling side of the market. So Amazon essentially has a monopsony in certain elements of our labor markets where they are the only game in town. That's the only job you can get. They control 80%, 70% of the labor market. They control how it works. So they are not perfectly competitive when they are buying labor. That's monopsony. But Amazon might also have control on the selling side. They're the only game in town when it comes to figuring out where can I buy or access the following goods as a consumer. And they're the only ones around. So monopoly is when you've got control by a single actor, a firm, as the seller. Monopsony is where you have control by a single actor, usually also a firm, on the buying side, where they are the only buyers of your labor force or of your minerals, or owning and being the people who buy all the mining you do, right? So monopsony is one kind of power. Monopoly is another kind of power. Oligopoly and oligopsony is an equivalent, is when it's not just one person, but you've got multiple players in action. And oligopoly is a bit more complicated, because you can have cartels, you can have lead buyers. Think of the oil market and the role that Saudi Arabia often plays in determining prices. They're not the only player in town, and they have to negotiate with other firms, but they may be a price setter inside the market. There is a whole bunch of stuff in oligopoly we can't cover in this class. It often requires either adapting the monopoly model. Your text has some descriptions of that. Sometimes it requires game theory, where you've got a lead oligopolist and followers inside the cartel and so on. So that one's going to require a lot more modeling and adaptation. So we're going to leave that aside at this very nascent intro level, but when you come to upper division classes, you will learn a lot more about how to handle this. Our focus is not going to be monopsony or oligopoly. It's going to be monopoly. That's our first adaptation. Our next unit will be additional kind of real world adaptations to quote-unquote market failure, where the real world doesn't look like the abstract ideal of the market. And we're going to talk about two very specific kinds of market failures: externalities and public goods. But we'll talk about what those look like when we come to that, because they require special adjustments to our model, just as monopoly does. So our focus is going to be on monopoly.